Peak Inequality, the 0.01%, and the Impoverishment of Society, Part 3, written by DeGraw. Part 3, Economic Slavery. Quote, "We are entering a new phase in human history, one in which fewer and fewer workers will be needed to produce goods and services for the global population." Unquote. Jeremy Rifkin, The End of Work. Beyond unemployment and underemployment, the percentage of full-time working poor has grown significantly. U.S. workers are presently producing twice as much wealth per work hour than they were in 1980. Instead of median incomes doubling since then, they have stagnated. The gap between wealth production and median income is now at an all-time high. Beyond unemployment and underemployment, the percentage of full-time working poor has grown significantly. U.S. workers are presently producing twice as much wealth per work hour than they were in 1980. Instead of median incomes doubling since then, they have stagnated. The gap between wealth production and median income is now at an all-time high. Based on the latest available individual level income data, 40% of workers make less than full-time minimum wage workers in 1968, roughly $20,000 per year according to the suppressed CPI inflation rate. More realistic adjustments for inflation will reveal a much higher total. For example, the current federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. If minimum wage had kept pace with overall economic inflation since 1968, the minimum wage would now be $21.16, which means a full-time minimum wage worker would now be making $44,000 a year. However, the median annual wage is only $27,519. Based on economic inflation, only 22% of the working age population and 15% of the overall population currently have an annual income higher than a full-time minimum wage worker had in 1968. The average person needs to generate $35,000 in annual income to cover the cost of basic necessities. Looking at the actual spending habits of the average worker, you need to generate an income of $42,000 to cover annual expenses. If we use $35,000 as our threshold for a living wage, only 30% of the working age population and 20% of the overall population generate an annual income over $35,000. For every 3 to 4 working age people, there is one that generates an income high enough to cover the cost of basic necessities without taking on debt. Keep in mind, that does not factor in the cost of paying off student debt. Average student debt is presently $29,400. If paid off over a 10-year period at an average 4.6% interest rate, it costs $306 per month, $3,672 annually. In this situation, a person needs to make an annual income of $38,672 to cover the cost of living plus their student debt. Only 27% of the working age population and 18% of the overall population generate that much income. For every 3 to 7 working age people, there is one that can sustain the cost of basic necessities plus the average student loan debt without taking on more debt. Mathematically eliminated from the American dream. For a worker to cover their own cost of living and the cost of one child, they will need to make roughly $45,000 a year. Only 22% of the working age population and 15% of the overall population currently generate enough income to support one child. For every one person that can generate enough income to sustain the cost of basic necessities for themselves and one child, there are 4.5 working age people. Now, think back to the American dream that prevailed from the 1950s to 70s. Each family had one wage earner supporting 3 children and one other adult who would care for the children. While this was considered the American dream, it is also the basis of a healthy society. How healthy is our society, and how many people can afford to live the American dream in today's economy? With today's cost of living, just to cover basic necessities, it will cost $80,000 per year to pull this off in the median family area, Topeka, Kansas. In the current economy, only 5.8% of the population can currently generate enough income to live that traditional American dream in Topeka. Clearly, we are not in Kansas anymore. Levittown, New York was the first suburb that gave birth to the American dream. Try pulling off the American dream in its birthplace, and it will cost $125,000 a year. Only 2% of the population can pull that off. Once again, these baseline costs do not take college or retirement costs into account. With the reduced cost in childcare, due to one person in the family focused on taking care of the children, they can at least put some money away for college, as long as they don't go away for vacation and none of their children go to a private school. Beyond these baseline costs, looking at moderate costs for a family of 4 owning a home in a median family area, with 1 car, education, and retirement costs factored in, it will cost $130,000 a year. Add a 3rd child and a 2nd car into the mix and it will cost roughly $150,000 a year. Only 1.46% of the overall population makes over $150,000 per year. In other words, in the current economy, the average traditional American dream is only attainable for the 1%. The 99% has been mathematically eliminated from the traditional American dream. If they want to have a family and own a home, they are now sentenced to a lifetime of economic insecurity and ever-increasing debt. As for retirement, if you American dreamers think you are going to retire at 65, it's time to wake up. There is no escaping. According to the National Institute on Retirement Security, quote, the median amount a family nearing retirement has saved for their post-work lives is $12,000, unquote. As 76 million baby boomers are due to retire, the real toll of this economic crisis is going to hit home in a huge way. Up until now, Social Security has been the savior. Currently, 57 million people receive Social Security benefits. In the present economy, that works out to 2 full-time workers for every 1 person collecting benefits. Adding 76 million to the 57 million people currently drawing benefits would mean 133 million retirees to 118 million full-time jobs. Even factoring in death rates, with new full-time jobs a rarity in today's economy, having 1 retired person to 1 full-time worker will soon be a reality. Even factoring in death rates, with new full-time jobs a rarity in today's economy, having 1 retired person to 1 full-time worker will soon be a reality. In fact, Social Security is already giving out more money than it is taking in. From 2010 to 2012, there was a $150 billion deficit. However, the Social Security Trust Fund is supposed to have $2.7 trillion in surplus. In reality, all that money was already spent on wars, bailouts, and tax cuts for the rich. As Charles Hugh Smith explains, quote, when Social Security runs a deficit, the Treasury funds it by selling Treasury bonds, the same way it funds any other deficit spending. If the Treasury can't sell bonds, the phantom nature of the trust fund will be revealed. Unquote. Given the corruption in Washington and the current fiscal debate, the likelihood of Social Security maintaining its promised returns is minimal. On top of that, the dramatic rise in healthcare costs and decline in full-time jobs make the current system inadequate and unsustainable. According to the Census Bureau, 54% of people over the age of 64 would be living in poverty without Social Security. The probability that the more fortunate members of the baby boom generation will collect full pensions and be able to sell off their assets to cover the cost of basic necessities in this economy is also highly problematic. And the happy story of boomers retiring on their generational wealth is wrong, Charles Hugh Smith sums up the situation. Quote, boomers' wealth will shrivel once they start selling assets en masse. The reality is neither Generation X nor Generation Y have the savings, income, or desire to buy bubble-level assets from their elders. This reality has been papered for the past 5 years of super low interest rates, which have enabled unqualified buyers to buy overpriced assets with modest incomes. Once the defaults start pouring in and/or interest rates rise, the reality will become visible. You can't cash in your wealth if there are no buyers. There are numerous other fatal flaws with the happy story that 76 million boomers can retire on full pensions and live off their home equity and stock portfolios. Pension funds based on annual returns of 7.5% will be unable to fund the promised pensions when annual returns decline to negative 5%. As John Hussman has explained, every asset bubble in effect siphons off all the future return. When the bubble finally pops, average annual returns are subpar or negative for years. Unquote. Another wave of foreclosures on the horizon. Since 2007, over 5.5 million families have lost their homes to foreclosure. The impact of that is horrifying to think about. The decision to bail out the banks to the extent that they were able to give out all-time record salaries and bonuses to the very people who caused the crisis, while millions of American families were thrown out of their homes, is the epitome of tyranny and corruption. Unfortunately, the foreclosure crisis is far from over. 6 million families are still underwater on their mortgages, and this number will increase. Their average negative equity is a shocking 33%. As Ellen Brown recently summed it up, quote, 40% of mortgages nationally are either underwater or nearly so, meaning more is owed on a home than it is worth. 70% of the homes that are deeply underwater wind up in default. Worse, second mortgages are due for a reset. Over the next several years, principal payments will be added to interest-only payments on second mortgages taken out during the boom years. Many borrowers will be unable to afford the higher payments. The anticipated result is another disastrous wave of foreclosures. Unquote. Looking at the overall picture, mortgage debt to wages is more than double the historic average. To make matters worse, the Federal Reserve has been fraudulently inflating housing prices. As part of their wealth extraction operation, they currently own $1.7 trillion in mortgage-backed securities and $2.4 trillion in Treasury securities. The illusion of prosperity and a tsunami of debt. The inevitable insolvency of the overwhelming majority of the population hasn't hit home yet because they have been taking on ever-increasing levels of debt to maintain the illusion of prosperity. Other than the staggering national debt that the corrupted government has run up, U.S. citizens have now taken on $12 trillion in personal debt. On average, that's $50,000 of debt for every U.S. citizen over the age of 17. Again, it cannot be stated enough, in the current economy under present government policy, it is impossible for this debt to be paid off while maintaining the cost of basic necessities. Therefore, overall debt will continue to skyrocket. Even if interest rates on these debts drop to 0% as the Federal Reserve has done for a select few of their friends on Wall Street, there is no way for people to earn enough income to keep up with the cost of living, let alone pay back their debts. On top of that, the already usurious interest rates on these debts are increasing. In fact, the spark that set off the global financial crisis in the first place is heating up once again. Quote, during the first quarter of 2014, 3.7 million credit cards were issued to subprime borrowers, up a head-scratching 39% from a year earlier, and the most since 2008. A third of all cards issued were subprime, also the most since 2008. In the first quarter, the average interest rate was 21.1%, up from 20.2% a year ago, while prime borrowers paid on average of 12.9% on their credit cards, and while banks that are lending them the money paid nearly zero. Unquote. If current trends continue and current policies remain in place, 90% of the U.S. population is heading for insolvency. That may sound like an exaggeration that is too absurd to be true. However, as The Guardian recently reported in an article headlined, The Coming Debt Tsunami, quote, so why look down the road, say to 2017, and worry? Here's why. The debt held by the American household is rising ominously, and unless our economic policies change, the debt balloon, powered by radical income inequality, is going to become the next bust. Failing government deficits are being replaced by rising debts on everyone else's ledgers. The majority of Americans, the 90%, will once again do what was done before: borrow, and then borrow more. By early 2017, it should be apparent that we are reliving an alarming history. Middle and low income households have been following a trajectory of an ever higher ratio of debt to income. The evidence demonstrates that the deleveraging of the very rich and the indebtedness of almost everyone else move in tandem. They follow the same trend line. In short, there's a strong and continuous correlation between the rich getting richer and the poor, make that the 90%, going deeper into debt. The more, proportionately, that the top 10% has prospered, saved, and invested, naturally the gains found their way into the financial market, the more the bottom 90% has borrowed. Insolvency for the 90% has become the new normal. Unsustainable? Of course. Under the current disastrous economic and tax policies, we can look forward to rapid increases in debt for both corporations and households from at least 2015 to 2017, a tsunami of debt. Unquote. The first wave of the coming tsunami of debt has already begun to wash ashore. For the first time since the depth of the recession, credit card debt is now rising faster than wage growth, yet another ominous indicator of what's to come. Crimes against humanity. Behind all of the statistics presented in this report is immense physical and psychological trauma. The stress of economic insecurity compounds the problem by leading to health problems, which dramatically increase cost of living. Economic insecurity drives people to expensive health care, medications, drug use, and crime. Beyond the moral and humanitarian imperative, recent studies prove that the cost of poverty to overall society is far higher than the cost of eliminating poverty. The short-sighted greed of the 0.1% is causing the unnecessary suffering of an unprecedented number of people. Their consolidation of wealth has created a system of economic slavery. In a wealthy and technologically advanced society, it is a crime against humanity for a majority of the population to be toiling in extreme debt, poverty, unemployment, and low-wage jobs.